The November wind cut through Larissa Everhart's worn shawl like 1,000 tiny knives, but she stood at the edge of Granite's Main Street anyway. Her basket of pies balanced carefully on the weathered wooden crate she'd dragged from the boarding house. Montana Territory, 1876, and winter was coming early this year. The other women in town had husbands to provide for them, fathers or brothers to see them through the harsh months ahead. Larissa had only her 2 hands and her late mother's recipe for apple pie. Thomas had been gone 2 years now. 2 years since the mining accident that left her a widow at 23, childless and nearly penniless in a territory that showed little mercy to those who couldn't keep up. The small savings he'd left behind had dwindled to almost nothing, and the boarding house where she rented a single cramped room would not extend credit past the end of November. Mrs. Patterson had made that abundantly clear just that morning. "Fresh pies," Larissa called out, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "Apple and berry baked this morning." A few miners passed by, their faces ruddy from the cold and hard labor. One tipped his hat but didn't slow down. Another glanced at her basket with interest but patted his empty pockets apologetically. The morning dragged on with only 2 pies sold, enough to buy flour and lard for tomorrow's baking but nothing more. By noon, clouds had gathered overhead, heavy with the promise of snow. Larissa's fingers had gone numb inside her thin gloves, and she was contemplating packing up the remaining 4 pies when the sound of hoofbeats made her look up. The rider came down the main street at an easy pace, sitting tall in the saddle on a dappled gray horse that looked well fed and cared for. The man himself was long and lean, wearing a brown duster that had seen some wear but wasn't threadbare like so many she saw. A dark hat shadowed his face until he drew closer, and then she could see he was young, perhaps 30 at most, with a strong jaw darkened by several days' stubble and eyes that were a startling blue even in the flat light of the overcast day. He reined in his horse directly in front of her makeshift stand, studying her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of her wind-chapped cheeks and the strand of dark hair that had escaped her hasty braid that morning. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and carried a hint of somewhere south, Texas maybe, or New Mexico territory. "Sir," she replied, straightening her spine. "Would you care for a pie? They're 50 cents each, fresh baked this morning." He dismounted in one fluid motion, looping his reins around the hitching post. Up close, he was taller than she'd thought, broad-shouldered beneath that duster. There was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that spoke of a man who knew his own worth and didn't feel the need to prove it. "What kinds do you have?" he asked, stepping closer to examine her basket. 4 apple, 2 berry. "The berries I preserved myself last summer." He nodded slowly, then looked at her face again with those unsettling blue eyes. "I'll take them all." Larissa blinked. "All of them, every one." He was already reaching into his pocket, pulling out coins that caught the dull light. "That's $3, isn't it?" "Yes," but she stopped herself. What was she doing, questioning a sale? "Yes, $3. He counted out the money into her palm, his gloved fingers brushing hers briefly. The coins were warm from being in his pocket, and she closed her hand around them gratefully. $3 would buy flour, sugar, lard, and even some dried apples from the mercantile. She could bake for days on $3. "Thank you," she said, carefully transferring all 6 pies from her basket to his arms. He took them easily, balancing them with a practiced air that suggested he was used to managing difficult loads. "That's very generous." "Not generous, just hungry," he said, but there was a slight quirk to his mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile. "And my crew gets tired of my cooking." "You have a crew?" working a claim about 5 miles north of here. Got 8 men total, and they've been complaining about beans and hardtack for 2 weeks now. That made sense, she supposed, though buying all 6 pies still seemed extravagant. Most mining crews scraped by on the bare minimum until they struck something worthwhile. He turned to secure the pies in his saddlebags, arranging them carefully so they wouldn't get crushed, when he paused and looked back at her over his shoulder. "I didn't catch your name." The question caught her off guard. In the 3 weeks she'd been selling pies on the street, no one had asked her name. They bought or didn't buy, offered commentary on the weather, sometimes complained about the prices, but none of them had cared to know who she was. "Larissa," she said, and then, because it seemed important somehow, "Larissa Everhart." He turned fully to face her, and this time there was definitely a smile, slight but genuine. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mrs. Everhart. I'm Dalton Garrett." The Mrs. stung a little, as it always did, a reminder of what she'd lost, but she managed a small smile in return. "Mr. Garrett, will you be here tomorrow?" he asked. "Same time," she nodded. "Weather permitting. I bake every day I can." "Good." He swung back up into the saddle with the same easy grace he'd shown dismounting. "I'll be back." Then he was riding off down the street, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust that the wind immediately scattered. Larissa watched him go, the $3 clutched tight in her hand, wondering if he'd really meant it about coming back or if it was just something men said. That night, in her small room at the boarding house, she counted her money by candlelight. $8.30 total. It wasn't much, not nearly enough to see her through winter, but it was more than she'd had that morning. She said a quiet prayer of thanks and began planning tomorrow's baking. The snow started around midnight, fat flakes that fell soft and silent. By morning, granite was covered in a blanket of white 3 inches deep, and Larissa had to wrap her shawl twice around her shoulders before venturing out to the mercantile. The streets were quieter than usual, most people staying inside by their fires, but she saw smoke rising from the stamp mill and knew the work would go on regardless of weather. Men still needed to eat. She bought her supplies carefully, measuring out her coins. Flour, lard, a small sack of dried apples, another of sugar. The mercantile owner, Mr. Hutchins, watched her count her money with an expression somewhere between pity and impatience. "Heard you sold out yesterday," he said as he wrapped her purchases in brown paper. News traveled fast in a small town. "I was fortunate. That Garrett fellow bought them all, from what I heard. He's been asking around about supplies for his crew." Mr. Hutchins leaned on his counter, warming to his subject. "Come in from Colorado, supposedly. Got some experience in hard rock mining, and thinks he can make something of the old Anderson claim." Larissa remembered the Anderson claim. Thomas had worked it briefly, years ago, before moving to the larger operation where he'd eventually died. Everyone said it was played out, nothing left but worthless rock. "Is that so?" she said neutrally, gathering her packages. "Probably be broke and gone by spring," Mr. Hutchins continued. "Most of them are, but I suppose his money spends same as anyone's while he's here." She thanked him and left, her arms full of supplies and her mind full of thoughts. Back at the boarding house, she spent the afternoon baking, her small room filling with the warm scent of cinnamon and apples. Mrs. Patterson knocked once to complain about the smell getting into the hallways, but Larissa ignored her and kept working. By evening, she had 8 pies cooling on the windowsill, the cold air outside serving as well as any ice box. Her back ached and her feet hurt, but there was a satisfaction in seeing the fruits of her labor lined up in neat rows. Tomorrow, if the weather held, she'd try to sell them all. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving the world clean and white and brutally cold. Larissa bundled the pies carefully in clean cloths and packed them into her basket, then wrapped herself in every warm thing she owned and made her way to her usual spot on Main Street. The town was busier today, men eager to get back to work after the snow, horses and wagons churning the white streets into brown slush. She set up her crate and arranged her pies, then stood back and waited. 2 miners bought pies within the first hour, warming her hands with their coins. An older woman she recognized from church services bought one, commenting approvingly on the golden crust. Then business slowed, and Larissa stamped her feet to keep the blood flowing, trying not to think about how much colder it would get in December and January. She didn't hear Dalton Garrett approach over the noise of the street, didn't know he was there until his voice said, "Good morning, Mrs. Everhart." She turned quickly, nearly dropping her basket. He was on foot this time, leading his gray horse, and in the morning light she could see his face more clearly. Handsome, she supposed, in a rough-hewn sort of way, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. There was a shadow of concern in his expression as he looked at her. "You look half frozen," he said bluntly. "I'm fine," she lied. Her teeth wanted to chatter, but she clenched her jaw against it. He shook his head slowly. "How many pies do you have today?" "5 left. I sold 3 already." "I'll take all 5. He was already pulling out his money. "But Mrs. Everhart, you can't stand out here in this cold all day. You'll catch your death." "I need to sell my pies," she said simply. What else could she say? That she had no choice, that it was this or starve, this or lose her room and end up God knew where. He probably already knew that, could read it in her worn dress and thin shawl. He paid her for the pies, $2.50 that she accepted gratefully. But instead of taking them and leaving, he stood there, his brow furrowed in thought. "Can you bake more than 8 pies a day?" he asked finally. "I suppose so, if I had the supplies and the oven space." "Why?" "Because my men really did like those pies yesterday. Ate them all in one sitting and have been asking for more ever since." He shifted his weight, his horse nickering softly beside him. "What if I paid you to bake for my crew regular, say a dozen pies 3 times a week? I'd pay you in advance for the supplies and then pay again when you delivered them." Larissa stared at him. "That's very kind, but I couldn't accept charity." "It's not charity, it's business. My men work harder when they're fed well, and I'm tired of cooking. You'd be doing me a favor." He named a price that made her eyes widen. It was more than generous. It was enough to see her through the winter with money to spare. Pride warred with desperation, and desperation won. "When would you want to start?" "Today, if possible." "I can give you money for supplies now, and you could bring the first batch out to the claim tomorrow. I'd send someone to fetch you, of course. It's too far to walk in this weather." She thought of Mrs. Patterson and her threat to evict. She thought of her dwindling savings and the long, cold winter stretching ahead. She thought of Thomas and what he would have wanted for her, and knew he'd tell her to take the offer and be grateful. "All right," she said. "I accept." The smile that broke across Dalton Garrett's face transformed it entirely, chasing away the serious set of his features and making him look younger, more carefree. "Excellent. Let me just get my horse settled and we can walk to the mercantile together. Make sure you get everything you need." He was as good as his word. They walked to Mr. Hutchins' store. Dalton's long strides shortened to match her pace, and he stood by while she selected flour and lard and dried fruit, never questioning her choices or trying to hurry her along. When she'd gathered everything, he paid Mr. Hutchins without haggling, then helped her carry the packages back to the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson watched from her doorway with unconcealed interest as Dalton carried the supplies up to Larissa's room. It was improper, perhaps, having a man in her room, but Larissa was past caring about propriety. She needed to survive, and if that meant bending the rules a little, so be it. "Thank you," she said when he'd set the last package on her small table, "for all of this." He looked around the cramped room, taking in the narrow bed, the single chair, the small stove that served for both heating and cooking. Something flickered in his eyes, but he didn't comment on the obvious poverty of her circumstances. "I'll send my man, Cole, tomorrow morning around 9. He'll have a wagon, make it easier to transport the pies." He paused at the door. "And Mrs. Everhart, thank you. It's not easy being new in a town. Knowing there's someone willing to help make things a little more comfortable for the crew, it means something." Then he was gone, his boots heavy on the stairs, and Larissa was left alone with her thoughts and enough supplies to bake for a week. She sank down on her bed, suddenly exhausted, and let herself feel the full weight of her relief. She would make it through the winter. She would survive. The baking took most of the night. Larissa worked by candlelight, her small stove doing double duty as she baked batch after batch of pies. The room grew warm from the heat, then hot, and she had to open the window despite the cold to let out some of the warmth. By dawn, she had 12 perfect pies cooling on every available surface, their crusts golden brown and their filling fragrant with cinnamon and nutmeg. She allowed herself 2 hours of sleep, then woke to wash her face and change into her better dress, a dark blue wool that had been her Sunday best back when Thomas was alive. It was a little loose on her now. She'd lost weight this past year without really noticing, but it was clean and modest and made her feel slightly more presentable. Cole arrived promptly at 9, a weathered man of about 40 with kind eyes and a respectful manner. He helped her load the pies into the back of the wagon, handling them as carefully as if they were made of glass, then handed her up onto the seat beside him. The ride out to the claim took nearly an hour, following a rough track that wound through pine forests and across frozen streams. Cole kept up a steady stream of conversation, telling her about the crew and their work, how Dalton had brought them all up from Colorado where they'd worked together before. "He's a good man, Mr. Garrett," Cole said as the wagon bounced over a rut. "Fair and honest. Doesn't ask us to do anything he wouldn't do himself. That's rare in my experience." Larissa nodded, watching the landscape roll by. The snow was deeper here, away from town, pristine and beautiful in the morning light. She tried to imagine spending all winter out here, working in the cold and dark, and couldn't fathom it. The claim itself was more organized than she'd expected. Several sturdy cabins clustered around a central area where mining equipment stood covered in canvas tarps. Smoke rose from 2 of the cabins, and she could see men moving about, going about their morning work. Cole drove the wagon right up to the largest cabin and helped her down. Dalton emerged as they were unloading the pies, wiping his hands on a rag. He'd shed his duster, and she could see he wore a simple work shirt and canvas pants, the sleeves rolled up despite the cold. There was a smudge of dirt on his jaw, and his hair was tousled as if he'd been running his hands through it. "Mrs. Everhart," he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "You made it. Your directions were excellent," she gestured to the pies. 12, as requested, apple and berry. "They smell incredible," he called out, and men began emerging from the other cabins, drawn by the promise of fresh baking. Larissa watched as Dalton distributed the pies, making sure each man got a fair share, listening patiently to their jokes and complaints. They respected him, she could see that. More than that, they liked him. One of the men, a young fellow who couldn't have been more than 20, approached her shyly. "Madam, these are the best pies I've had since leaving home, better than my own mother's, though don't tell her I said so." Larissa felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "Thank you," I'm glad you enjoy them. Dalton came back to her side, a pie in his hand. Come inside and warm up before you head back. It's the least I can offer. The cabin was simply furnished but clean, with a large table dominating the center and a substantial stove in the corner. Maps and papers were spread across the table, and she caught a glimpse of surveying equipment stacked neatly against one wall. This was clearly both Dalton's living quarters and his office. He poured her coffee from a pot on the stove, strong and hot, and she wrapped her hands around the cup gratefully. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the sounds of the crew working outside filtering in through the walls. How long have you been widowed? Dalton asked suddenly, then looked startled at his own bluntness. I apologize, that was too forward. It's all right, Larissa said, though her throat had tightened at the question. 2 years. My husband died in a mining accident. I'm sorry. And he sounded it, his blue eyes soft with genuine sympathy. This territory is hard on women alone. It's hard on everyone, she replied. But yes, it's particularly difficult without a husband or family. No family at all, she shook her head. My parents died when I was 18. Thomas was all I had, and then he was gone too. Dalton was quiet for a moment, studying his coffee. My wife died 3 years ago, he said finally. Cholera in Denver. We'd only been married a year. The revelation surprised her. She'd assumed he was a bachelor somehow, though she supposed there was no reason he couldn't have been married before. I'm very sorry. Thank you. It's part of why I left Colorado, I think. Too many memories. He looked up at her, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. But life goes on, doesn't it? We keep moving forward because the alternative is to give up, and neither of us seems the type. No, Larissa agreed softly. We're not. They talked for another half hour, the conversation flowing more easily than she would have expected. He told her about his mining work, his hopes for the claim, the challenges of managing a crew in the harsh Montana winter. She told him about her pies, her small room at the boarding house, the way the town had changed since Thomas died. It felt good to talk to someone, to be seen as more than just the widow selling pies on the street. When Cole indicated it was time to head back if they wanted to reach town before dark, Dalton walked her to the wagon. Same time on Friday, he asked. I'll be ready. Good. He handed her an envelope. Payment for today, plus advance for the next batch. And Mrs. Everhart, if you ever need anything at all, you send word with Cole. Understood, she nodded, clutching the envelope. When she opened it later, during the ride back to town, she found he'd paid her double what they'd agreed upon. She should have been angry at the charity, but instead she felt only grateful. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. 3 times a week, Cole would come to collect her and her pies, and they'd make the journey out to the claim. Dalton always greeted her warmly, always invited her in for coffee while the crew devoured her baking. They would talk, sometimes for just a few minutes, sometimes for an hour or more, their conversations ranging from the mundane to the profound. She learned that he was 29, that he'd grown up on a ranch in Texas before turning to mining, that he loved horses and good whiskey and the smell of pine forests after rain. He learned that she'd wanted to be a teacher before she married, that she missed having a garden, that she sang to herself while she baked, though she'd die of embarrassment if anyone heard her. The other men on the crew grew accustomed to her presence, greeting her by name, sometimes slipping her extra money with requests for specific types of pies. She started varying her recipes, making cherry and peach when she could get the preserved fruit, even attempting a custard pie that turned out better than she'd hoped. December deepened, and with it the cold. Snow fell almost daily, piling up in drifts that made travel treacherous. Twice, Cole couldn't make it to town, and Larissa found herself oddly disappointed to miss her visits to the claim. She told herself it was just the break in routine, the loss of income, but she knew it was more than that. She'd come to look forward to her conversations with Dalton, to the way his eyes lit up when he saw her, to the sound of his rare but genuine laughter. On the last delivery before Christmas, Dalton had a proposition for her. "The crew wants to put together a Christmas dinner," he said, pouring her the usual coffee. "Nothing fancy, but more than the usual beans and salt pork. I was wondering if you'd be willing to help. I'd pay you, of course, and we'd come into town to buy whatever supplies you needed." "What did you have in mind? Roasted chickens, maybe. Potatoes, vegetables, bread, and pies, of course. Lots of pies." He grinned. "I was thinking we could do it here Christmas Day. You could come out in the morning, spend the day cooking, and then join us for the meal. Cole and some of the other men have families in town they'll bring along. Make it a real celebration." The idea of spending Christmas alone in her small room had been weighing on Larissa's mind. This sounded infinitely better. "I'd be honored." "Excellent." His smile was warm enough to chase away the cold. "And Mrs. Everhart, I'm glad you'll be there." She was glad too, though she didn't quite know how to say it. Instead, she just smiled back and accepted another cup of coffee. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue that hurt to look at. Larissa had been awake since before dawn, packing supplies and preparing what she could in advance. She'd made a new dress for the occasion, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and she'd taken extra care with her hair, pinning it up in a style she hadn't worn since Thomas died. Mrs. Patterson had raised her eyebrows at Larissa's appearance, but said nothing, perhaps intimidated by the regular payments that had been coming in all month. Larissa no longer worried about being evicted. She had enough money saved now to last through the winter, with some left over for spring. The pies had saved her, but more than that, Dalton Garrett had saved her. Cole arrived with the wagon decorated with pine boughs, and his wife Martha, a plump, cheerful woman who immediately embraced Larissa like an old friend. The ride out to the claim was festive, Martha chattering happily about the dinner and the celebration, her excitement infectious. The main cabin had been transformed. Someone had brought in a small pine tree and decorated it with strings of dried berries and paper ornaments. The table had been extended with boards to accommodate more people, and the stove had been stoked to a roaring heat. Dalton greeted them at the door, his face clean-shaven for once, wearing a white shirt that looked freshly pressed. "Merry Christmas," he said, his eyes going to Larissa and staying there for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "You look beautiful." She felt herself flush. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Garrett." "Dalton," he corrected gently. "I think we know each other well enough for first names, don't you, Larissa?" Hearing her name in his deep voice sent a strange flutter through her chest. "Dalton," she agreed. The day was a whirlwind of cooking and laughter. Martha proved to be excellent company, full of stories and jokes that had Larissa laughing until her sides hurt. Other wives and children arrived, filling the cabin with noise and warmth. Larissa found herself in her element, organizing the cooking, directing the preparation, making sure everything came together at the right time. Dalton was in and out all day, checking on things, helping where he could, but mostly just watching Larissa with an expression she was coming to recognize. It made her nervous and pleased in equal measure, this attention from a man she'd come to respect and, if she was honest with herself, care for. The dinner was a magnificent success. The chickens were perfectly roasted, the potatoes creamy and rich, the vegetables seasoned just right. And the pies, 8 different varieties, were declared the best anyone had ever tasted. They ate until they couldn't eat anymore, then sang carols around the piano that one of the men had somehow hauled out from town. As the evening wound down and families began preparing to leave, Dalton found Larissa alone in the kitchen area, washing dishes in a basin of hot water. He picked up a cloth and began drying without asking, working beside her in comfortable silence. "Thank you for today," he said finally. "You made it special." "It was my pleasure. I haven't had a Christmas like this in years." "Me neither." He set down a dried plate and turned to face her fully. "Larissa, I need to tell you something." Her heart began to pound, though she couldn't have said why. "What is it?" "I've come to value our time together more than I can say. You've become important to me, more important than I probably should admit." He took a deep breath. "I know it hasn't been long, and I know the circumstances of our meeting weren't exactly conventional, but I'd like permission to court you. Properly, I mean. Not just seeing you when you deliver pies, but taking you to dinner, going for walks, spending time together like two people who are interested in each other." Larissa's throat had gone dry. She'd hoped in her secret heart but hadn't dared believe. "I'd like that very much." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. "Yeah, yes." She found herself smiling back, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I'd like that a great deal, Dalton." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. "I'm going to make you happy, Larissa Everhart. I promise you that." And looking into his earnest blue eyes, she believed him. The courtship that followed was the talk of Granite. Dalton came into town every Sunday, dressed in his best clothes, to escort Larissa to church services. Afterward, they would walk through town, his hand respectfully at her elbow, stopping to speak with shopkeepers and neighbors. He took her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, the nicest place in town, and didn't even blink at the prices on the menu. He brought her small gifts, thoughtful things that showed he'd been listening to their conversations. A book of poetry he thought she'd enjoy, a warm shawl in a deep blue that matched her eyes, a packet of seeds for the garden she'd mentioned wanting to plant come spring. In return, she baked for him, not just the pies for his crew, but special things made just for him. Cookies flavored with molasses and ginger, a cake layered with jam, sweet rolls studded with dried fruit. He ate everything with obvious enjoyment, always thanking her profusely. They talked about everything. Their pasts, their hopes for the future, their fears and dreams. He told her about his wife, Sarah, and the guilt he'd felt at her death, as if he should have somehow been able to save her. She told him about Thomas, about the baby she'd lost in the months after his death, a grief she'd never shared with anyone. "I thought I'd never feel happy again," she confessed one afternoon as they sat in the hotel restaurant, watching snow fall outside the windows. "I thought that part of my life was over. And now," Dalton asked softly, "now I think maybe I was wrong." She met his eyes across the table. "You make me feel alive again, Dalton, like there's a future worth looking forward to." He reached across the table and took her hand, heedless of who might see. "Larissa, I'm falling in love with you. I think I started falling the first day I saw you, standing in the cold trying to sell your pies with your chin up and your eyes full of determination. You're the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. "I love you too. I fought against it, told myself it was too soon, that I was being foolish. But my heart doesn't care about timing or propriety. It just knows that I love you. Marry me," he said suddenly, urgently. "I know it's fast, I know people will talk, but I don't care. I want you in my life, Larissa. I want to wake up beside you and fall asleep holding you and build a future together. Marry me." She should have said they needed to wait, should have been sensible and cautious, but she'd been sensible and cautious long enough. "Yes," she said through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed in February in the small church in Granite with half the town in attendance. Larissa wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Dalton had ordered specially from Helena, and she carried a bouquet of dried flowers that Martha had helped her arrange. Dalton stood at the altar in a new black suit, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the aisle. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Dalton kissed her for the first time as her husband, Larissa felt as if her heart might burst from happiness. She'd thought that part of her life was over, that she'd never again know the joy of being loved and cherished. But here she was, beginning again, and it felt like a miracle. They held the reception at the hotel, with food and music and dancing that went on late into the night. The crew from the claim was there in force, along with what seemed like everyone in Granite. Even Mrs. Patterson showed up, though she spent most of the evening looking mildly disapproving of the whole affair. As the evening wound down, Dalton led Larissa outside for a moment alone. The night was cold but clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his chest, feeling warm and safe and loved. "Happy," he murmured into her hair. "Happier than I ever thought I'd be again," she said honestly. "Thank you, Dalton, for seeing me, for choosing me, for loving me. Thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy with more dreams than sense." He turned her in his arms to face him. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this." "I could never regret this," she said, reaching up to cup his face. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." They decided to live at the claim, at least through the mining season. Dalton had added a room onto his cabin, creating a proper bedroom with a real bed and a window that looked out over the mountains. It was rough compared to town living, but Larissa didn't care. She had a stove to cook on, a roof over her head, and the man she loved by her side. That was more than enough. The spring brought changes. The snow melted, revealing the rocky ground beneath, and the crew returned to their mining with renewed energy. Dalton's instincts about the claim proved correct. They struck a good vein in April, not enough to make them rich, but enough to ensure comfortable living and the means to keep exploring. Larissa planted her garden in the cleared space behind the cabin, working the soil with her hands and feeling it come alive beneath her fingers. She grew vegetables for the crew's meals and flowers just for the beauty of them. In the evenings, she and Dalton would sit on the porch he'd built, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose, talking about their day and their plans. In June, she realized she was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with equal parts joy and terror, memories of her previous loss haunting her. But Dalton was there, steady and supportive, holding her when she cried and reassuring her that everything would be all right. "We'll get through this together," he promised. "Whatever happens, we face it together." She made him ride into town to fetch the doctor, an older man named Henderson who examined her carefully and pronounced her healthy and strong. He gave her instructions for her care and promised to check on her regularly. Dalton took his advice as gospel, insisting Larissa rest more, eat more, worry less. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Larissa bloomed, her cheeks growing rosy, her figure rounding. The crew treated her like fragile glass, despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities. Dalton hovered constantly, until she finally had to sit him down and tell him firmly but lovingly that she needed him to relax. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she said, exasperated but touched by his concern. "Women have been doing this since the dawn of time. I'll be fine." "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair. I can't lose you, Larissa. You're everything to me." Her expression softened and she took his hands in hers. "You're not going to lose me. I'm strong and I'm healthy and I'm going to give you a beautiful baby. Trust me." He did trust her, she knew, but that didn't stop him from worrying. She found it endearing, this big, strong man reduced to anxiety over her well-being. It reminded her daily how much he loved her. In January of 1878, during a snowstorm that raged outside their cabin, Larissa went into labor. Dalton immediately rode for town, returning with both Dr. Henderson and Martha, who'd agreed to assist with the birth. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following morning, but Larissa was strong and determined. When the baby finally arrived, announcing his presence with a lusty cry that filled the cabin, Dalton was there to cut the cord with shaking hands. Dr. Henderson cleaned the infant and placed him in Larissa's arms, a perfect little boy with dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same blue as his father's. "A son," Dalton breathed, staring down at the baby with wonder. "We have a son." "We do," Larissa agreed, exhausted but elated. "What should we name him?" They discussed names during the pregnancy but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their newborn son, Dalton said, "What about Thomas? After your first husband, he'd want you to be happy, I think, and this way, he's still a part of your life." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Larissa's eyes. "Thomas Dalton Garrett," she said. "It's perfect." The first months with baby Thomas were exhausting and wonderful. Larissa had forgotten, or perhaps never fully known, how demanding an infant could be. She spent her days feeding and changing and soothing, catching sleep in snatches whenever the baby allowed. Dalton helped as much as he could, walking the floor with Thomas when he was fussy, changing diapers without complaint, bringing Larissa food and drink when she was too tired to get it herself. "You're a natural father," she told him one night, watching him cradle their sleeping son. "Look at you, completely smitten." "How could I not be?" Dalton said softly. "He's a part of you, Larissa, a part of us. He's proof that good things can come from heartbreak, that life goes on and brings joy we never expected." As Thomas grew, so did the mining operation. The vein they'd struck proved richer than expected, and Dalton was able to hire more men and invest in better equipment. By the time Thomas was walking, Dalton had become one of the more successful miners in the area, respected for his fairness and business acumen. They built a real house on the claim, a 2-story structure with glass windows and a proper kitchen and bedrooms for their growing family. Larissa furnished it carefully, balancing comfort with practicality, creating a home that was warm and welcoming. She still baked, though now it was for pleasure rather than survival, her kitchen always filled with the scent of fresh bread and pies. In the spring of 1880, their daughter was born, a tiny little thing they named Lily. She had Larissa's dark hair and Dalton's blue eyes, and she wrapped both her parents around her little finger from the moment she arrived. Thomas, now 2, was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to help care for her. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Dalton managed the mine with help from Cole, who'd become his right-hand man and closest friend. Larissa managed the house and children, occasionally helping with the books for the mining operation. They hosted dinners for the crew and their families, held Christmas celebrations that became local traditions, and became integral parts of the Granite community. Larissa no longer sold pies on street corners to survive, but she remembered those cold November mornings, standing in the wind with her basket and her determination. They'd led her to Dalton, and for that, she would always be grateful. One evening in late summer, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Dalton found Larissa sitting on the porch, looking out at the mountains. He settled beside her, putting an arm around her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How different my life is now from what it was 4 years ago," she said. "I was so scared then, so alone, and now look at me. I have a husband I love, 2 beautiful children, a home, a future. Sometimes it feels like a dream." "It's not a dream," Dalton assured her. "It's real, and it's ours, and we built it together." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't bought all those pies that day? If you'd just ridden past like everyone else?" "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "But I don't believe I could have ridden past. Something drew me to you that day, Larissa. Fate, providence, whatever you want to call it. We were meant to find each other." "I believe that too." She lifted her head to look at him. "I love you, Dalton Garrett, more than I can ever say." "I love you too." He kissed her softly. "My brave widow who sold pies to survive winter and ended up saving my life as surely as I helped save hers." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and learning. Lily was her opposite, wild and adventurous, always climbing trees and chasing after the crew's dogs. In 1883, they had another son, Samuel, who was sweet-natured and gentle from the start. Dalton's mind continued to prosper. He became wealthy by Montana Territory standards, wealthy enough to consider moving to Helena or even San Francisco if they wanted. But neither he nor Larissa wanted to leave Granite. This was their home, the place where they'd found each other, and they had no desire to go elsewhere. They did make improvements, though. Dalton built a proper school in town, hiring a teacher to educate the children of Granite. Larissa was on the committee that ran it, finally getting to contribute to education even if she wasn't the one standing in front of the classroom. They donated to the church, helped families who fell on hard times, and employed as many local people as they could. The town grew around them, transitioning from a rough mining camp to a proper community. More families arrived, more businesses opened, and the lawlessness that had once characterized frontier life gave way to civilization. Larissa watched it happen with satisfaction, knowing that she and Dalton had played their part in the transformation. In 1886, Montana achieved statehood, and Granite celebrated with the rest of the territory. Dalton and Larissa stood with their 3 children, watching fireworks light up the summer sky, reflecting on how far they'd come since that cold November day in 1876, when a widow with a basket of pies had caught a cowboy's attention. "You remember what you said to me, the first time we talked?" Larissa asked Dalton that night. "You said life goes on, that we keep moving forward because the alternative is to give up." "I remember. You were right. We kept moving forward, both of us, and look where it brought us." She gestured to encompass their children, their home, their life together. "I'm so glad we didn't give up. So am I." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "So am I." By the time the 1890s arrived, Thomas had grown into a young man, preparing to head east for college. The idea of him leaving was bittersweet for Larissa, proud of the man he'd become but sad to see him go. Dalton shared her feelings, though he hid them better. "He'll come back," Dalton assured her the night before Thomas was to leave. "This is his home just like it's ours. He'll go get his education and see the world, and then he'll come back and probably run the mine better than I ever did." Larissa hoped he was right. But whether Thomas came back or not, she knew they'd raised him well, given him the tools to succeed in whatever he chose to do. That was all any parent could hope for. Lily showed no interest in leaving. She loved Montana, loved riding horses through the mountains and helping manage the household. At 15, she was already receiving attention from young men in town, much to Dalton's consternation. Larissa found his protectiveness amusing, remembering how forward he'd been in his own courtship. Samuel, at 10, was still a child, more interested in his studies and his collection of rocks than in the future. He had time yet to figure out what he wanted from life. The mine continued to produce, though not as richly as in earlier years. Dalton had diversified, investing in cattle ranching and property in town, ensuring their financial security regardless of what the mine did. He was planning for the future, for his children and grandchildren, building a legacy that would last. One evening in the fall of 1895, Larissa was preparing dinner when Dalton came in from the mine early, a strange expression on his face. She set down her spoon, concerned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he said, but he was grinning now. "Larissa, we just hit a new vein. The assayer thinks it's the richest thing we've ever found. If he's right, if it runs deep, we're looking at more wealth than we ever imagined." She should have been excited, but instead she just felt calm. "That's wonderful, Dalton, truly. But you know what? We're already rich in all the ways that matter." He crossed the kitchen and pulled her into his arms. "You're absolutely right. We have our health, our children, each other. That's the real treasure." "Though I won't say no to a new stove," she teased. "This one is getting old." "You can have a dozen stoves if you want them," he laughed. "Anything you want, Larissa, you know that." "I have everything I want," she said seriously. "Right here, right now. You've given me a life beyond my wildest dreams." "We gave each other a life," he corrected. "I was just existing before I met you, going through the motions. You made me whole again." The new vein did prove to be lucrative, just as the assayer predicted. The Garrett family became one of the wealthiest in Montana, but the money didn't change them. They lived well but not extravagantly, continued to help their community, and raised their children with the same values they'd always held. Thomas returned from college in 1896 with a degree in engineering and ideas for improving the mining operation. Dalton welcomed his input, gradually transitioning more responsibilities to his capable son. It was a relief, in a way, to share the burden, to know that the business would be in good hands when he was ready to step back. Lily married in 1898, a good man named William who worked as a surveyor. Larissa cried happy tears through the entire ceremony, remembering her own wedding day 21 years earlier. Dalton walked their daughter down the aisle with obvious pride, though he looked suspiciously misty-eyed by the time he gave her away. Samuel showed an interest in medicine, and they sent him to school in the East to study. Larissa missed having him home but was proud of his ambition, his desire to heal and help others. All three of their children had grown into good people, and she and Dalton had done that together. As the new century approached, Dalton and Larissa found themselves with time they'd never had before. The children were grown and launched. The mine ran smoothly under Thomas's management, and they could finally just enjoy each other's company without the constant demands of work and family. They traveled some, taking a trip to San Francisco that Larissa found overwhelming but exciting, and another to Texas so Dalton could show her where he'd grown up. But they always came back to Granite, to their home in the mountains, because that's where they belonged. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1902, Dalton surprised Larissa with a party at their home, inviting everyone they knew in Granite and beyond. The house was packed with friends and family, with people whose lives they'd touched over the years. Cole and Martha were there, now grandparents themselves. Dr. Henderson, retired but still spry, made a toast to the happy couple. Even Mrs. Patterson showed up, finally admitting that she'd been wrong about Larissa all those years ago. When the party wound down and the guests departed, Dalton led Larissa outside to the porch. The night was warm, unusual for Montana even in summer, and the stars were brilliant overhead. 25 years, Larissa marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that we met, and sometimes it feels like I've known you my whole life. Both are true, I think, Dalton said. He pulled a small box from his pocket and handed it to her. I got you something. Inside was a ring, a band of gold set with a single perfect sapphire the color of a Montana sky. It was beautiful, elegant without being ostentatious, exactly her taste. Dalton, it's stunning. I wanted to give you a proper engagement ring, he explained. I never did back when we married. Things moved so fast and money was tighter then, but I always meant to. She slipped it onto her finger where it sat perfectly beside her simple wedding band. It's perfect, thank you. No, thank you, for saying yes to a cowboy with nothing but a claim and a dream, for building a life with me, for giving me children and a home and 25 years of happiness. His voice was thick with emotion. You're still the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, Larissa Garrett. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today. She kissed him then, there under the stars, tasting salt from the tears on both their faces. I love you too, always and forever. The years continued their march. Lily gave them grandchildren, 3 rambunctious boys who filled the house with noise and laughter whenever they visited. Thomas married a schoolteacher from Helena, a smart, kind woman named Catherine who Larissa adored. Samuel completed his medical training and returned to Montana, setting up a practice in Helena but visiting Granite often. Dalton's hair went silver, but he remained strong and active, still riding out to check on the mine most days. Larissa's dark hair showed strands of white, and her face bore the lines of a life well lived, but Dalton still told her she was beautiful, and in his eyes, she could see he meant it. They celebrated their 30th anniversary quietly, just the two of them, and a simple dinner. Dalton gave her a locket containing pictures of their children and grandchildren. She gave him a journal she'd been keeping for years, filled with memories of their life together, stories she wanted to preserve for future generations. So they'll know, she explained as he paged through it, his eyes shining. So our great-grandchildren will know how we met, how we loved, how we built this family. It's the greatest gift you could have given me, he said. Besides yourself, of course. In 1908, as they approached their 33rd anniversary, Dalton suffered a heart spell. It wasn't serious, doctor, Samuel assured them, but it was a warning. He needed to slow down, rest more, let others handle the work. Dalton grumbled about it but complied, knowing his son was right. He handed over the last of his responsibilities to Thomas, who ran the mining operation with skill and innovation. Dalton filled his days with reading, with time spent with grandchildren, with long conversations on the porch with Larissa. I don't mind getting old, he told her one day. Not when I'm getting old with you. She squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar calluses that decades of work had left. We've had a good life, haven't we? The best, he agreed. No regrets, Larissa. Not a single one. They celebrated their 35th anniversary in 1912 surrounded by family. All 3 children were there with their spouses and children, the house bursting with Garretts. Looking around at the faces of her family, Larissa felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This was her legacy, not just the children she'd borne but the values she and Dalton had instilled in them, the love they'd created that rippled outward. That night, alone in their bedroom, Dalton held her close. "Do you remember that first Christmas?" he asked. "When I asked to court you, of course I remember. I was washing dishes and you were drying them and I thought my heart would beat right out of my chest." "Mine too," he admitted. "I was terrified you'd say no." "I could never have said no to you, Dalton. From the moment you bought all those pies and asked my name, I was yours." He kissed her forehead. "And I was yours. I am yours, I always will be. The winter of 1914 was harsh, the coldest in years. Dalton caught pneumonia in January, and despite Samuel's best efforts and Larissa's constant care, he grew weaker. She sat by his bed day and night, holding his hand, talking to him, reminding him of their life together. "Remember the day we met," she said softly one evening. "You rode into town on that gray horse, and I was so cold I could barely feel my fingers, and you bought every pie I had." Dalton's eyes opened, still that same brilliant blue despite his illness. "Best purchase I ever made," he whispered. "Led me to you." "We've had 38 years," she said, tears streaming down her face. 38 beautiful years, 3 children, 8 grandchildren, a life I wouldn't trade for anything. "No regrets," he said again, his voice fading. "Promise me, Larissa, no regrets." "No regrets," she promised. "Only gratitude for every moment we had." He slipped away peacefully in the early hours of the morning, with Larissa holding his hand and their children gathered around. The grief was crushing, a physical pain in her chest, but underneath, it was a deep wellspring of thankfulness. She'd loved and been loved, had built a life and a family, had known joy she'd thought lost forever after Thomas's death. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Montana. Dalton had touched many lives, had been respected and loved by so many. But Larissa knew that she'd known him best, had loved him most, and she would carry that love until her own last breath. She lived another 7 years, staying in the house they'd built, surrounded by children and grandchildren. She baked pies still, teaching her granddaughters the recipes that had once saved her life. She tended her garden, wrote in her journal, and spoke of Dalton often, keeping his memory alive. On a warm summer evening in 1921, Larissa Everhart Garrett passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 75 years old, and she'd lived a life full of love and purpose. They buried her next to Dalton in the cemetery overlooking Granite, under a shared headstone that read, "Together in life, together in eternity." Her children cleaned out the house after her death, dividing up possessions and memories. Thomas found the journal she'd kept, the one she'd given Dalton all those years ago. He read it cover to cover, tears streaming down his face, then gathered his siblings. "We need to preserve this," he said. Mother wrote down their story, everything from how they met to their last days together. It's a testament to what love can do, how it can transform lives. And so they did. The journal was copied and shared among the family, passed down through generations. The story of the widow who sold pies to survive winter, and the cowboy who bought everyone and asked her name became family legend, told and retold, a reminder that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, that second chances exist, and that a life lived with love is a life well lived. The mine eventually played out as all mines do, but the Garrett family prospered in other ventures. They remained in Montana, in Granite and beyond, carrying forward the values Dalton and Larissa had instilled. Hard work, compassion, generosity, and above all, love. Years later, a great-great-granddaughter visited the cemetery in Granite, standing before the shared headstone. She'd read the journal, knew the story, and had come to pay her respects to the couple who'd started it all. She placed fresh flowers on the grave and whispered a thank you to ancestors she'd never met, but whose love had made her existence possible. The wind rustled through the pine trees, carrying the scent of summer wildflowers, and for a moment she could almost imagine she heard voices, laughing and talking, a man and a woman who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful. The cowboy and the widow, together still, their love story echoing through time, a reminder that even in the harshest winter, Love can bloom and bring warmth that lasts forever.